The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. This quote from George Orwell echoes the very real and present reality Europe faces today. And the reason European history is under such assault is not just injustice or indeed morality, but one of ideology. The natural urge people have is to preserve their culture, traditions, and identity. But this can be tamed if their view of their past is one of shame and not pride. When individuals in the UN call for reparations, some even arguing a staggering £20 trillion is owed, or even when UK politicians demand reparations, there is only one type of imperial history they are referring to, which is European history, which from a purely logical view can seem a bit odd, given that slavery and conquest has been a geopolitical reality since ancient times, with Arabs and Africans participating en masse. The trans-Saharan slave trade, to take just one example, was every bit as brutal and as large as the transatlantic slave trade, but is seldom mentioned, nor is the Muslim conquest and enslavement of much of Europe. And this, I suppose, is the nuance. Reparations themselves are only demanded from Europeans, despite slavery and conquest being as universal as marriage. A good example with regards to Sadiq Khan is his official visit to Pakistan as Mayor of London. Despite the fact he was visiting arguably what I'd say is the slavery capital of the world, a nation which certainly enslaves millions, Khan didn't mention the word once. Now, this isn't an issue in of itself, of course. However, it is odd given back in London, Khan is spending millions on a statues commission and renaming rail lines. Aside from renaming and banning, even history itself is being rewritten. Now, to most of the world outside Europe, this would be seen as madness, to undermine one's own culture, history and values, and to hold such contempt for the first nation to abolish slavery, at the same time as largely ignoring where slavery actually exists today. The underlying truth is the attacks on our history within Europe are down to the same reason all traditions and values in Europe are under attack. And although morality is often the driving cry of people decrying European history, political arguments, let's not forget, will always, as far as they can be premised on morality. It's just a very easy way to sell an argument. However, this moral argument is nonetheless very difficult to circumnavigate when one engages in the discussion, because it is the consensus. So any challenge to this, regardless of how tame, is met with varying degrees of derision. Take Nigel Beggar's work. This is actually a very good example. His book on colonialism, although very balanced and well researched, was ultimately cancelled by Bloomsbury, after initially being accepted, which does give an indication of how little room there is outside the prevailing narrative. This work isn't even really countercultural to my ear anyway, but it does do a great job of providing context, talking of how Britain was actually the first to abolish slavery. And this wasn't something simply brought about by Parliament, but also by large sections of the British public who actually signed petitions at the time to put an end to the practice. A practice that hundreds of years later remains more prevalent than ever. What is actually surprising is the extent that the British went to enforce the abolition of slavery, because that's practically unknown. The patrolling of the Atlantic coast in order to prevent slave ships from operating, an act that Britain continued to do even during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1873, 2 British cruisers appeared off the coast of Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless slave markets there shut down, which they did. And this action actually continued into the 20th century, a time in which Arabs were still the leading slave raiders in East Africa. It's information such as this that Beggar and others have attempted to shed light on, and they have a hard time because, of course, the narrative remains. Consequently, these works, objective as they are shunned, cancelled from publication, or just seen as reprehensible by the mainstream. Not because they are. As I've said, the works of people such as Nigel Beggar and Thomas Sowell are, generally speaking, very moderate, but their work does highlight inconsistencies with the narrative that Western Europe has been taught to accept. So, factual or not, it is unwelcome. The reality that Arabs were enslaving people long before Europeans or that 1 million plus Europeans were enslaved by the Barbary slave trade, or the reality that European slaves were still being bought and sold in the Ottoman Empire long after Europe led the charge to abolish slavery, is correct, but it is an inconvenience to the prevailing theory. This theory was highlighted very well at a 2024 Reparations conference held in London, where Diane Abbott reaffirmed the need for reparations, but claimed that the demands were just about justice and the moral good. So the rhetoric is certainly very plausible on the surface. The bit to remember, of course, is despite the virtue signalling, she is only attacking European history. So it's a very distorted view of history, objectively speaking anyway. A view which arguably doesn't appreciate how universal slavery was, or indeed where the word itself derives from. So, given this, I thought it would be a useful exercise to briefly explore these ideas and see how well they stand up. First of all, the idea that imperialism made Britain wealthy. And secondly, that imperialism explains the wealth imbalances today. So, first of all, let me deal with the idea that imperialism made Britain wealthy. Now, this isn't true because Britain became very wealthy, powerful and successful as a nation and a society long before it expanded. It was this power, wealth and success that ensured the nation had the ability to pursue such grand imperial goals in the first place. No weak nation could ever attempt such feats. And whilst this pursuit had very great geopolitical advantages for the time, imperialism, in the old world anyway, was simply a natural response to a thriving nation, and ensured the survival of the nation. This explains the constant shifting of borders over time. Thriving societies would seek to consolidate their power as basically a means for protection. There was no point having a wonderful society if it could be attacked by a bigger foe. But Britain could have forgone such an endeavour and industrialised without a slave trade, such as nations like Switzerland and Germany did. Nations who became incredibly rich and industrialised without a slave trade. Switzerland never even had an empire, and the Scandinavian nations never had an empire outside of Europe. And if one is to accept the premise that colonialism and slavery explain away the wealth imbalances today, then it would be fair to ask the question why there are many nations, and such as Benin, who engaged in mass slavery are still poor today. And why is Ireland richer per capita than Britain, given it was a colony? And why are nations who've been independent for hundreds of years, such as Haiti, still in a state of turmoil, while nations who've been constantly exploited, invaded or attacked, been able to, in a very short period of time, overturn many hundreds of years of plight and become wealthy? And I think here, Poland is probably the best example, enduring invasion, exploitation and mass tragedy. Even as late as the 1990s, there were several nations in Africa with higher GDPs than Poland. But look at where the nation is today. And this does lead me on to the wealth imbalances in the world today. So, for a start, let's just take two former colonies, Singapore and Jamaica. Both are former colonies of Britain. Singapore has no natural resources to speak of, while Jamaica, on the other hand, does. And that's very important for the modern world. But, despite this, Singapore has flourished, while Jamaica has declined drastically. At the time of British rule, Jamaica actually had one of the lowest crime rates in the world, around 3.9 per 100,000 inhabitants. However, by now, as I'm sure many of you know, it has one of the highest crime rates in the world. Crime and corruption has exploded. That stands in stark contrast to Singapore, which is an incredibly safe country. Irrespective of past ills or geographical problems, a nation ultimately thrives or falls on how it manages itself and its resources. A nation's ability to achieve this largely comes down to the level of trust between the people within the nation. Whilst this is somewhat problematic today, there is some acknowledgement with regards to this as a reality. Haiti, for example, is still a failed state after hundreds of years of independence, and $20 billion in aid. So some questions are being asked. Why is this the case when nations such as Japan can be levelled to the ground and then be rebuilt in minimal time? And why was Germany already rebuilding just weeks after the end of World War II under unimaginable conditions in which millions starved to death? However, probably the most jarring example is that of China. Not so long ago, it was an impoverished nation, poorer than the vast majority of Africa. And of course, now, as we all know, it's a world power. So, the interesting point here is that studies do indeed tend to show that high trust is a key indicator of success for a country, and a driver of innovation and development. But this view has largely run against the prevailing theory since the war. In the aftermath of World War II, there was a rush, not just for Britain, but for all major European powers to collapse what remained of their empires, and to do so quickly. A very understandable sentiment at the time, though this rapid approach would yield consequences. However, the pressure to do so was enormous, as many in Britain and elsewhere now naturally sympathised with the rising insurgencies against foreign rule. Tied to this, it is important to take note that imperialism didn't just die in Europe, but all over the world. The age of nations across the globe, either being an empire or aspiring to be one, was over. Security could be obtained without the need for imperialism. This overwhelming tide was in large part due to the fact that in the post-industrial world, imperialism, at least from a cost-benefit point of view, no longer really made sense. John Mearsheimer described the British Empire as an albatross around the nation's neck in the post-industrial world. As stated, nations could and did prosper, whether they engaged in imperialism or not. It had very little correlation for success, and this is also true for long independent states. The common thread which determines success for a nation, generally speaking, is not past ills, but the nation itself and level of trust. And this is why some former colonies thrived, while others didn't. A high trust nation is ultimately something people will feel part of, something they'll pay taxes to, and something, in some cases, they'll willingly die for. A nation is not simply a GDP and some abstract values. Mankind is, by nature, tribal, and the nation-state has always met this basic human condition. Ignoring this has arguably led to a lot of false assumptions abroad. Going back to Poland, they built their beautiful and prosperous society, not by giving up their values, but because of them. They endured far more than Britain, not just during the wars, but in the decades that followed. But today there is little blame, little resentment, and certainly no seeking revenge. Britain and Western Europe, however, are now declining socially. A high-trust society has morphed into one of individuals. So history, in essence, becomes a weapon and is being used to prevent any kind of nationhood being revived. Because by undermining history, you dissolve the connection between people and their identity and belonging. And consequently, the narrative has prevailed that seeks to make sense of the world and the enduring wealth imbalances within it at the hands of Europe. British rule was so vast, so it will always be easy to find evidence to share a very strong view on it one way or the other. And there is of course the ongoing debate as to where the blame lies, with people such as Zaria Masani not just arguing that the British Empire was a good thing for its time, but also defending its culpability regarding some of its darkest associations, believing the consensus to be ill-judged. Some of course completely refute this, and some have a view of compromise. Others understand that imperialism brought infrastructure, the rule of law and democracy in a volatile world full of conquest, but also that it exploited. Regardless of what you deem to be true, the imbalance of blame is compelling, and this blame applies to all European nations, regardless of whether they had an empire or not, and is omitted from the rest of the world. Along with the mass exploitation today. Discussions around the level of trust within a society, and this being a predictor of success, are problematic at best. Because this isn't at heart a moral argument to my mind anyway, or even an objective one. but one of ideology. One that not just shapes history, but rewrites it, in a way that would be almost unimaginable outside of the West. Nations all over the world present history very differently, and it typically rhymes with how the nation governs itself internally. So I'll leave this one here for now. I hope you did enjoy it. Take care.